Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar, Secure Virtual Infrastructures from the Ground Up. My name is Kevin Cook and I'm a Market Development Manager with Terakai Corporation. I'm pleased to introduce to you today Chris Squire. Chris is an industry leader with over a decade of experience building and designing real-world security solutions. Today, Chris will present on how the move to virtualized infrastructure can create security issues. We'll discuss design tips and technologies to help you leverage the power of your virtualization investment while mitigating your attack profile. And so without further delay, I'd like to pass things over to Chris and allow him to begin the presentation.
Well, thanks very much, Kevin, and thanks, folks. I do appreciate you joining me today. I'm going to go ahead and get this presentation started. So a lot of crazy things in the virtualization world these days, for sure. What we've got going on here is a lot of hypervisor-based attacks. You know, we've seen a lot of different things from the hypervisor standpoint. And what's really weird is there was a lot of focus on that, but not a lot of understanding in terms of what does it really take to jack a hypervisor. You know, we've seen some theoretical stuff such as Blue Pill, which is called hyperjacking, and really what they're talking about is inserting a hidden hypervisor in between the OS and the hardware and trying to fool the operating system through emulation or paravirtualization or whatever and thinking it's talking directly to the bus. And so, yeah, we've seen a little success of that, but nothing outside of the theoretical world. And a lot of security functions were really focusing on that. And so right now, it's mostly in theory. Really, like anything else, you know, a hypervisor layer in and of itself is another layer of complexity. While it does have some great advantages in terms of consolidation, in terms of resiliency in the organization, business continuance, and all those other things, you know, like any other code, there's going to be some vulnerabilities that are going to pop up. And those vulnerabilities, when you look at the vulnerability releases for VMware and Zen and all these other things that are out there, they look pretty big. There is compromise there to get to root or to take over one or more guest virtual machines or even management consoles or things like that. The good news is, though, that hypervisor vendors are getting that. They understand that. So and they understand that things are going to get more complex because APIs are getting built now to allow, and have been getting built, to allow more code to be put in there by third parties, whether it be virtual switches, security firewalls, management utilities, and other things like that that are necessary in larger environments, but certainly introduce more complexity. So the hypervisor vendors are designing security tools and using their code and technologies from the ground up to try and keep that code light, to keep that code small. But like anything else, it is going to grow at some point soon. I get asked a lot about what kind of attacks are there out there, and you might see my whole desktop here. I just want to make sure everybody's going on. There we go. So there is some precedent toward various hypervisor attacks. There's one you might have heard of in 2009 called the VAServer incident. So VAServer was a company in Europe that offered very economical virtual hosting of websites and various applications, and it was based on a Linux platform, and there was a vulnerability in a virtualization application that was built by a company called LX Labs. The attacker was able to get root and ran the command rm-rf, and for any Linux geeks like myself out there, you know what that does. So if you're root and you run that, it basically deletes your directories recursively. Wiped out the sites, and there were no backups. On the right-hand side of the page, you'll see a screenshot there of what the actual VAServer website looked like after the attack. The best they could do is put up updates via Notepad. So that said, you know, it was an unmanaged hosting service, so there weren't any frills like backups or anything like that. But very little data was recovered as of the last report. So yeah, there is potential there. So the moral of the story is, right, design well from the ground up, just like any other technology. Like I said earlier, you are introducing complexity, but you're also introducing an opportunity here to build a more resilient organization. Here's an example of some of the recent vulnerabilities that are out there. IDC released some numbers. They're a little lagging, but they're fairly recent in terms of a release report in 2010. In 2009, 18.2% of servers shipped were virtualized, which was a 20% increase over 2008. So you can imagine in 2010 and 2011 how many more were shipped with virtualization. Now, a very interesting report was released by IBM Research, and I should have the link at the end of this now. We can send it out after. It's a really good read. It said 40% of virtual machine vulnerabilities were severe and considered easy to exploit. But what was weird, though, was only 14% of those had exploits crafted. Have we seen it in practice? Personally, in my territories between two little bodies of water, Atlantic, Pacific, and Arctic Ocean, I personally haven't seen those exploits in practice and actually perpetrated against organizations, but I'm sure there are incidents out there for sure. But when you talk about vulnerabilities and you're trying to class them, they can be broken down into essentially 6 classes. The first is management console vulnerabilities. Well, they kind of speak for themselves. Every virtualization technology, especially in server virtualization, has some type of management console, whether command line interface or a web-based interface or some type of proprietary client. Management server vulnerabilities. If you're using a separate management server to manage your VM farm, then there's vulnerabilities there. Administrative VM vulnerabilities. For large-scale environments, you may have a couple dedicated VMs running some software that helps you administrate from inside the VM environment. And of course, the ones that you probably hear about the most or worry about the most are guest VM vulnerabilities, hypervisor vulnerabilities, which we touched on earlier, and hypervisor escape vulnerabilities. In other words, finding a flaw within the tools client or something like that that allows them to get, or the attacker to get out and touch another virtual machine, or perhaps even the hypervisor or some part of the virtual network in and of itself. If you want to take a look at how that breaks down in terms of those vulnerabilities that were announced, hypervisor escape is the biggest one, with taking about 38% of the share, followed by administrative VM vulnerabilities and guest VM vulnerabilities. And then following down there, your management console, management server, and about 6.5% or so, not quite sure, maybe one or more of the above. So it is a relatively new technology in terms of mass deployment, so there's still going to be some mystery involved in that. One thing to note, though, with this particular chart is that the actual hypervisor vulnerabilities themselves only accounted for a little over 1%. So I think in the security world, it's just my opinion, we concentrated quite a bit on those hypervisor vulnerabilities, but all the while not really looking at the bigger picture. And I think that's where the vulnerabilities truly start, is not looking at it from a holistic perspective. So we know about some of the vulnerabilities. Let's just talk a bit about some attack vectors that we should be aware of. These are some relatively new terms. If you're well into vulnerability or virtual machine management, you've probably heard of these before. If you're relatively new into it, you might not have, but I'll go through these real quick. Some of the attack vectors that we do get concerned about these days, the first one is called guest hopping, and we talked about that a little bit more or in the last slide. It's similar to the hypervisor escape. If somebody can exploit something within the guest tools or additions, there's a possibility to see another virtual machine and jump to it. Whether you're able to exploit that guest tools to turn up some memory space where another virtual machine is in there and get to it, those can go from easy to relatively complex depending on the nature of the vulnerability. So they range pretty widely. Or how about somebody inserting something into the image during creation? Well, if we could put a little exploit code into the image at the time of creation, once it's solidified gold master, it's a solidified gold master or certified gold master, once each subsequent VM gets deployed, that has that vulnerability. We have seen some of that before out there in the field. This one's relatively complex. It's been done in labs before, but I have not seen this done in practice, but it is out there and it has been proven. a man-in-the-middle migration attack. So if you're migrating your VMs over to another environment or to another machine or something like that, there is the possibility to intercept and modify during the migration. You kind of have to know from the inside, though, of course, when that's going to happen. You have to have a real good amount of knowledge of the environment. The easy way to defeat that is to make sure that your traffic is encrypted. Now, solutions like VMware will encrypt the traffic right across the line. Many of the other top solutions will do that. Some do not, or earlier versions do not. So it does make sense to take a look at whatever virtual machine solution you're using right now, if you're using the latest and greatest, to make sure that traffic is encrypted going across the wire. So with all this jazz I'm talking about here, you might ask yourself, well, does virtualization then make it more or less secure? Well, done right, it can make an organization more resilient, and it absolutely does. There's no doubt about the fact that having a good virtualization solution in place makes for not only a more economically run or efficiently run organization, but also allows a great amount of resiliency in times of disaster, whether it be a power outage and we have to take the virtual machines and start them up somewhere else, or a true disaster, a true natural disaster or something else. But as we said earlier, and we'll say again, it does add a new layer of complexity that we need to deal with. Ultimately, my thoughts are around this is that the basic things that people trip over are not the technical things. The technical things are well documented. VMware, Citrix, so forth and so on. These guys have some great documentation out there on how to, from a technical standpoint, secure your networks or secure your virtual environments. But what becomes a challenge is having the policies and procedures in place from the ground up to make sure as you're building these environments or growing these environments that you have a process and a lifecycle management program in place to make sure that those vulnerabilities are kept to a minimum as you grow. So I went through a lot there in the last few slides. So there's a lot of things we could worry about, right? Data breach, denial of service, heap overflow in the memory, finding some information within the memory that gets me to another virtual machine. The old standard privilege escalation, we worry about that with everything. Even exploited vulnerability in a third-party API, right? Okay, I get it, right? We're not going to freak out like our little guy in the right corner there. I think what the answer really comes down to is this. You have a good security-aware implementation plan, a good change management plan, and the right tools for the job, and we can make this a lot simpler. We can make it a lot less complicated and make this more efficient. All right. So the common worries I find from my experience in virtual environments when they're getting deployed. One, absolutely virtual sprawl. Whether it's realistic in the IT environment for your particular IT environment or not, that's one thing. But my experience has been that executives are worried about this. So you go to CIO.com or anything like that, CIO Online, you see a lot about this and worry about this. So understanding what virtual sprawl really is and really kind of putting assurances in place and a plan in place to avoid that. The second is having approved baseline secure images. How do we go about doing that? What does a baseline image make sense for, and how do we keep those in the environment? Prioritizing criticality, and then separation of duties for sure. We'll get into that as well. Visibility into how the virtual networks are communicating. And management, yeah, we get it, properly securing it, but not seeing the entire big picture. In terms of how does the virtual environment play with our physical environment, our legacy environment that we still have, our cloud environment? Right? All these things introduce new complexities, and we have to be aware of all of that. The good news is there's some great tools that are out there right now that will help you do just that. So first up, virtual machine sprawl. It sounds scary, for sure, right? But the virtualization is has such a dynamic nature that that's a great strength of it. When you need that computing power, you can absolutely spin up some VMs, run them for a while. When you don't need them anymore, tear them down, and that's a great thing, right? But it's easy for organizations, even mid-sized organizations, to lose track of that, and especially in times of boom and bust and so forth and so on. Cyclical businesses have challenges with that. Right? So it is a great strength, but it also it can be an Achilles heel for sure. When it comes down to it, it's about lifecycle management, security lifecycle management, information lifecycle management, having an understanding of how do changes get implemented, what procedures and who has to sign off on that, and not introducing more complexity per se, but just having an understanding, a base understanding of if you're going to go and spin up a machine, people need to know about it, and it's got to be an approved image. And there's got to be some people that do sign off on that to make sure we're keeping track of that and managing that in the environment. Of course, implementation, segmentation, and you can even put in there, how do we retire virtual machines? You know, how do we retire, recycle that information, archive it, so forth and so on. And I think that's where the information lifecycle management conversation comes into play. Ultimately, you know, technologies that we really invest in, you know, we've invested a lot in technologies that do asset and inventory management, and so forth and so on, network mapping. Those technologies may or may not see into the virtual layer. They may not see into the virtual networks as much as we would like them to. Now, the traditional asset and inventory tools that are out there are getting very smart very quick and understanding if I'm not playing in this game, if I can't make a virtual asset and inventory management server, I'm not going to be in the game very long. So it's getting better. But what I do see is I do see tools that are trying to be used that are for traditional legacy environments that are not really accounting for the virtual network, the virtual environment to a great degree, and it really hurts the organization, especially if you're under compliance regulations. So if you haven't looked at your asset and inventory tools and things like that, take another look at them for sure and see if there's updates or upgrades, or even a virtual blade you can put in there into your environment that can take a look from the inside and out and keep track of what's going on in your virtual environment. So the second thing is creating a baseline guest image. This is just like really, I don't think there's really any mystery to any of this. If you've ever secured a server or a desktop before or anything like that, a lot of it stays the same, right? One, you disable any unneeded hardware or services, right? If you need them, you can enable them later on the image, and you'll have a change management process in place to do that. But whatever our services or unneeded hardware, do you need to connect to USB ports, things like that, or whatever in this virtual image, go ahead and disable those, and then you have a good baseline of a core OS that you can start using. If you're in a Linux or Unix or BSD environment, try and see if you need the X window system. Do you need Genome, or do you need KDE, or whatever you need to do for your particular environment. In some cases you might, but in many cases in those environments you probably don't. So the X window system's great. You know, there's similar systems that are out there like that for those environments, but you do have another layer of complexity that you're having to deal with. If you're not really using it, disable that. On the Windows side of things, right, it's the same deal really, right? It's core server enough to run the applications and services that you want. If we can get rid of any environmental possible vulnerabilities within a GUI system, well then go ahead and do so if it makes sense, you know, if it doesn't add too much complexity to your environment. We talked about virtual USB ports, and it doesn't hurt to, when you have your final image or your gold master, we take that term from the audio world, when you have your gold master, spin it up and hit it hard. Scan it to see what it's saying. Use Nmap, Metasploit, use some internal tools on it to see if you can go ahead and grab passwords. Whatever you need to do, there's a plethora of free utilities that are out there that you can use to hit that gold master and see if there's anything talking or if there's anything running on the inside that you missed that shouldn't be there, so forth and so on. And also, are there any functions that will allow information to escape the guest system? Are there copy and paste functions and things like that? I don't worry a great deal about that particular vulnerability in a true virtualized environment in terms of, and when I say true, I use that with quotes, in an environment that is using a true hypervisor rather than a host OS and a guest OS, things like that. But if you are in a smaller environment, you are using a host guest OS type of scenario, that could be a vulnerability. You just need to check that out and see if that makes sense for your organization. But the cool thing is once you get a baseline guest image, you can go ahead and use this image knowing that it's secured for your organization and has the core functionality you need, and then build other images that are application specific on top of that, knowing that you have a good gold master. And of course, you're going to want to have a policy in place for who has access to those masters, who distributes them, who keeps track of them, how do we segment those out so we protect them, because they are a huge information asset at that point. So moving right along, security classification and separation. This is what's kind of interesting. You can talk to this in two ways. I think you can talk to it in terms of the virtual segmentation and the actual real-world physical segmentation. Let's talk virtual for a moment first. So VLANs are our friends for sure. We can do VLANs in our virtual world as well as our physical world. If we go ahead and segment out critical networking segments via VLAN or some other type of firewall or things like that, it does help minimize things like ARP spoofing, which is really redirecting virtual machine traffic, and other types of compromises that will reveal themselves if you have your critical stuff on the same VLAN. So there's many ways to do this. One way to do it is have a virtual firewall between your critical segments, your critical servers, and the rest of your environment. Several virtualization vendors have that type of functionality either built in or have it as an add-on, or there's third parties you can use and do it that way as well. But you can group your virtual machines and avoid mix and match when it comes to physical hardware. It's a good idea to prioritize your virtual environments between low, medium, and high in terms of criticality. And it's just like anything else. If you're familiar with doing a risk assessment or anything like that, you do this in the physical world too, and it's no different here. There's two things that there's always not a lot of: time and money, right? So we have to figure out where we're going to put our biggest effort in terms of time and spend in our virtual environment, and of course that's going to go with our critical can't do without. So also in terms of the physical world, it might be a good idea if you have a larger VM environment to separate access to critical systems as well. Maybe use some access controls like biometrics or some access card technology or something like that. Put them in a separate, those physical systems in a separate room to be able to have people unable to remove blades or things like that. And it provides an audit trail too, of course. If you're under whatever compliance regs you might be under, a lot of times you're going to want to have an audit trail of who's had access to what room where. So some other ideas here, whenever possible, you want to use separate physical NICs for each zone you create. That just helps out with administration, keeping track of things, not overloading any physical NICs with virtual NICs on there. It's such an easy way to, and inexpensive way to go ahead and introduce some security and make management a lot easier, keeping track of where the traffic is going. I don't see a reason for not doing that for most cases. So. Promiscuous mode, right, on NICs, right? In promiscuous mode, the NIC's listening to everything. Well, we don't want any traffic that's not supposed to go across that line, So if it makes sense in your organization to disable promiscuous mode, and you want to protect your virtual MAC addresses too. So some VM systems, certainly if you've been in the virtual environments for a while, you can do MAC address request changes. Well, that's a great way to spoof somebody. If you can change your MAC address, you can get traffic routed to the spoofed address and leave you high and dry. So there's some vulnerabilities that have been out there around that. So I think it's something that it's worth taking a look at. Okay, so moving right along into secure management. So we know some of the basics, right, from day one. When we design these things out, we want to have a plan to isolate the management network to only authorize traffic. We also know that we want to use a secure protocol like SSH or some other type of encrypted line for administration. And of course, you know, the administrators, we want to have separation of duty whenever possible. Not all, and you know, I know it's not realistic for all environments, so don't shoot the messenger here. But when you can, it certainly does make sense to separate duties so somebody doesn't have all the keys to the kingdom. If you can use some type of LDAP directory or Active Directory for authentication rather than local, you know, in general, that just makes things a lot cleaner. It helps you build a default secure configuration, and specific to needs of the business function, you can go ahead and lock down certain access and authentication and privileges through a central directory. So nothing different there than any other physical environment. And really what we're talking about there is the principle of least privilege. Just like it's a standard that's been around for a long time, right? So trust but verify, sometimes you'll hear that too. For those of you who may be in the Linux and Unix world, you know the power of sudo or su, right? It's for those of you who are not, you'll see this little cartoon on the right that kind of explains it. What sudo or su, depending on your environment that you're using, allows you to have a limited admin area, in other words, within the command line space. So if you do have to have some type of virtual root access without actually giving away the keys to the kingdom, you can use the power of sudo. And really what it allows you to do is if you have sudo privileges, you're part of the sudoers file, you're able to execute some commands that will allow administrators to administrate the system, but also protect some critical areas, whereas a full root login would be compromising that. Do you have a service client that you have to deal with? Well, like anything else, you know, patching it and having access controls put in place is really makes sense, right? So just look at what this all really says is ultimately, however you're going to manage your environment remotely, web-based, console-based, multiple vectors, proprietary client, just understand what the path is, where that signal or that connection path is running to, how it's secured from end to end, who has access to it, and how much access do they have at any given time. And of course, you want to keep your logs rolling on that too. So, as I alluded to earlier, talking about the big picture, you know, most environments that I've seen, you know, and there are some that are really state-of-the-art and they're pretty impressive, but you know, most of the real-world scenarios is that these IT environments are in a state of flux. It's really a combination of our physical systems that, you know, we just can't get rid of right now, and you know, it really isn't practical to virtualize them for whatever reason. You know, virtual and cloud technologies. A lot of organizations of all sizes, you know, are dipping their toes in the water and trying to understand, does it make sense for us to keep certain functions like email in-house or like security scanning in-house, or do we go into, you know, do we bring that into the cloud and have some fixed costs? And, you know, there's no right or wrong answer. It really depends on what your environment is. But when you're juggling, you know, what we thought we were going to see, or what the industry was saying was, you know, back in the day of mainframes, hey, if you break it out to microservers, you're going to have a more practical environment to manage. Well, then we had microserver sprawl. And we said virtual is the way to go. And then so we had virtual sprawl, but we kept some physical machines. And now, you know, the industry's staying cloud. And they're all good choices, but it's in the implementation that's a challenge. Right? So we got to keep track of all this stuff end to day. Right? So we need some visibility. How are these environments interacting with each other? My recommendation is when you're looking for management utilities, you want to look for some utilities that can centralize all these environments into a single console. So you get a broad-based view of what your all three environments look like, and even be able to, and there's some applications, Novell's got some applications that'll do this, and some other ones that are out there, that will allow you to see how you're utilizing your physical, your virtual, and your cloud environments, and understand, hey, you know what, this application might be better in a virtual environment, or this server might be better in a cloud environment. You're not utilizing your environment to the degree that you could and should. Well, that's a great thing. And so you can come up with a plan to migrate as needed, shut down services you don't need, and so forth and so on, and save money. Understand the relationships. The management utility should understand how the physical, virtual, and cloud environments work toward each other, where are their points of communication, what's being communicated, how that's going across the line. What's really cool about these type of next generation management utilities is not only will they let you see less than optimal security configurations, but as I said earlier, it'll show you better ways of using what you've invested in. And you can even find out, hey, you know what, maybe I can retire some stuff, traditional servers that I don't really need anymore. I haven't thought about this. I can move this into a virtual and/or cloud environment and do those upgrades that I wanted to do. So, the big third-party add-on question. So APIs are getting opened up all over the place, and we're seeing a wealth of new companies with great new ideas and plugins for the virtual environment. Traditional companies, especially in the security space, traditional firewall, unified threat management companies, anti-malware companies, so forth and so on, just taking the intelligence out of their appliances and putting it into a software environment. And that's great. There's great things that you can do with that. But when you use third-party add-ons, a good thing to have in place if you implement them, and you probably will at some point, it makes sense, is to have some type of testing methodology, a patch management policy, and limit the profile to only what you need from the plugin. So a lot of these plugins or virtual devices and things like that have a wealth of features, and that you might want to implement them all at once. But like a great example is virtual UTM appliances. Well, they'll have anti-malware, they'll have content filtering, they might have anti-spam, firewall, IPS. Does it make sense to turn all that stuff on at once? Maybe, maybe not. So we have to figure out what makes sense in the environment, and as we grow, we can enable those features as they make sense. But it also, whatever add-ons you're going to use, it should understand how to allocate resources in a VM environment. Especially a security solution like an anti-malware solution, traditional anti-malware solutions or endpoint protection solutions out there don't quite understand the virtual environment to the degree that they could and should. They may rely on some type of guest host per instance, where there's going to be a separate process for each instance that's going to come onto that virtual environment. And that could really take a toll on your process or your resources in your virtual environment. So you got to be careful of that. But the good news is there's a lot of great solutions that are coming out right now that understand that, hey, you know what? If I can go ahead and look at the stuff going across the hypervisor, I can protect that hypervisor, and anything that's going to come across into the guest system is going to come into that hypervisor, right? So I can catch it there and utilize resources centrally, more holistically. Trend Micro's got core protection for virtual machines. There's several other utilities that are out there. McAfee's got Move Antivirus and even scanning for offline virtual images. So a lot of great solutions that are out there. But they do have to understand the virtual environment. Okay, so here's where I get a little scared. Is I think that in the virtual, and we've concentrated on the virtual server environment to a great degree so far. I think if you have a good plan in place for the creation, disposition, and enablement and deployment of virtual machines in a server environment, you've got a good portion of the game licked. But where it gets crazy is virtual networking. So because we can't really see it to any great degree. Unless you have some good virtual aware mapping technologies to see that stuff, it could go out of sight, out of mind. So it's really critical as you design these virtual networks out to have plans, diagrams, change management in place, and really be and see ahead for a little bit and understand how the information assets reside and flow through that virtual network onto your physical network and back again. Where do you need to go ahead and put in your controls? Are they virtual controls? Are they physical or traditional logical controls? Well, it all depends, how critical the information is. It could be VLANs, it could be firewalls and UTM, intrusion prevention, and probably a combination of all this stuff, depending on what you got going on. But Where that comes into play is understanding how your information flows in your environment. Right? What gets accessed the most? What information is considered critical? Is it marked? Right? What machines does it reside on? Who's got access to it? And that's a whole separate presentation that I'm happy to give to you at another time if you want to talk about information lifecycle management. But I know it's kind of a legacy term, but I do harp on ILM quite a bit because when I see breaches occur, it's usually because there wasn't a great understanding of, well, I'll take that back and say from an IT standpoint, there wasn't a great understanding of where the critical assets in the organization were truly residing and where they were flowing. The initiator, in my experience, is usually somebody from the inside, but everybody's experience varies depending on what they touch. But the core situation was we were looking to the left when our core information assets were residing on the right, and we were putting all our money toward the left when on the right was really where we needed to be. So just having an ILM type of policy, and it doesn't have to be that complex, but having some type of ILM policy plays a role, whether it be virtual or any other environment. So diving into that just a little bit, when we talk about lifecycle management, whether it be virtual machines or the information that sits on them or security policy and architecture, we're concerned about 5 things. One is creation and receipt. How do we create this stuff in a proper and secure manner? Who gets to receive this stuff to be able to implement that? Right? Distribution. How are these distributed among your environment? What organizations get what, where, and how do we keep track of that? What is the average active use time for this particular application or information or virtual machine? And is it limited to that use, or is there other uses that it's being used for? And if so, how do we segment that out? The ongoing maintenance, who gets to touch what roles are played by each administrator, how are they separated, how do they come together, all that stuff. And finally, disposition. And disposition, I think, is an area that gets looked over quite a bit. Whether you're in a virtual environment or compliance or traditional security best practices or things like that, it's not so much about, yeah, we understand, yeah, put a hole through the hard drive, hit it with a magnet, and then you can recycle it. Well, I think it goes a lot farther than that these days, for sure. But ultimately, what we're looking at is who gets to handle the spin down of virtual machines? Do they get archived or do they get destroyed? How do they get destroyed? Do we encrypt them? So forth and so on. But when you do that and you have a plan in place, if you're under compliance regulations or e-discovery or whatever you have to deal with, and it's not just the financial sector. I personally am seeing small and medium businesses getting socked with PCI compliance issues right now, even mom and pop shops. So they're out there and they're getting hungry, right? But it's better to be able to say we have a plan in place. Yes, we assumed we were going to have a breach. Everybody has a breach at some point or another. It's too complex to protect everything. But when that breach or that incident does occur, you can say, hey, look, here's our policy. Here's how we handle it. Here are the logs. Here's everything you need. We've got it. Let me get back to doing business. Right? More resilient BCDR. I won't harp on that too much more. And of course, you're spending some money in your virtualization investment and the hardware that's associated with it. You want to make the best use possible of it. So understanding how your information resides gives you a better level and understanding of how you're going to use your hardware and your investments. So, what about the future of virtualization security? At the moment, I talked about earlier, there's a lot of vulnerabilities that are in hypervisors and management utilities and stuff like that, and even in guest VMs, and the big thing is, the guest VM tools. Yeah, there's a lot there. We're still not, at least in my neck of the woods, I'm not seeing a lot of cybercrime organizations that are directly attacking virtual environments. It's still more of, there's a couple of things I think are going on right now. Is that one, there's a glut of credit card information on the market right now, and cybercriminals are not making as much money as they used to. So they're really competing heavily on there. What they're looking for, what brings more value, on the black market right now are credentials. If you can get good credentials, and not just going after an enterprise environment, because odds are these days, if you're going after an enterprise environment as a cyber criminal, you're running a bigger risk of getting caught. The tools are pretty good out there. They kind of tend to go to the smaller partners and try and get in through the back door. So, there's a lot of vulnerabilities that are out there, but we're not seeing a lot of exploits. My point is they're still focused. It seems like they're still focused on the traditional, I don't care whether it's a guest VM or a hypervisor or what, or I'm sorry, excuse me, if it's a guest virtual machine or an actual physical machine. I just want to get the credentials I need to get, to sell them. So, at the end of the day, if I can sell credentials to somebody who has an interest in getting some more information out of that organization, then I'm going to go and do that. It doesn't really matter whether it's virtual for me. On the other side of the coin, in terms of hacktivism and other things like that, well, yeah, I might have a good interest in going after a hypervisor to pull a thing like the VAServer incident. But right now, I don't see it quite there yet. But certainly, I think it will be, and several of you in the audience may have some stories to tell in that area too. I'd love to hear them if you do. The more we share information, the better off we all are, for sure. So, and a need to better understand and do more research into virtualization security, I think, are going to lead to better standardization. Again, the vendors are doing a great job in this area, but they can't do it alone. There's only in most cases, like any vendor, they're going to see well into their environment, but maybe not into other environments that are going to play into their environment or as well. So, we have to see more third-party research. I think we could use more virtualization and security research out there. I know there's several colleges that are working on this right now. Again, IBM has done a great job in putting out some virtualization white papers on virtualization security. But I think there's more that needs to happen there to get a better standardization and body of knowledge out there. So, as we're coming toward the end of our little presentation here, some final thoughts. Ultimately, it's like anything else. The Boy Scouts say, and it may sound hokey, but they say be prepared, and boy, that's true. It's really more about having good plans in place. If you have a good plan in place for change management, patch management, lifecycle management, separation of duties, things like that, you're going to have a better chance of keeping your environment secure from the ground up. And it's harder, like most other technologies implement, it's harder to do that after the fact than it is to do it when you start. So the sooner you can start that, the better. So most of the breaches that are out there, I think, or vulnerabilities, I should say. Breach is a bad word. It means, kind of has happened. Vulnerabilities can be prevented by covering the basics. There's always going to be some vulnerability that's going to come out in some part of the virtualization environment. But if you have technologies that are there that are virtualization aware, that can do patch management, even offline patch management, there's a lot of great tools that'll do that for you on your masters and your environments that haven't spun up, to keep them current. But think of the broader risk management approach. Think about how your virtual environment connects with your physical and your cloud environment, who's talking, who's sharing what, and so forth and so on. And finally, just remember, Terakai is here to help. They've got their strong partners with many virtualization vendors. They have a great track record, and I appreciate them bringing me in here today to talk to you. So that said, I'll return it over to Kevin.
Thank you so much, Chris. So let's jump right into it. We have a few questions here queued up. The first is around desktop virtualization, or VDI. Any tips or pointers on how to adopt some best practices around securing desktops?
Yeah, securing desktops is an interesting thing, and maybe we'll, at some point we'll have the opportunity to do a follow-up on desktop virtualization. It comes down to, a lot of it is, I think, where I get concerned is around things like data loss prevention. Trying to recycle, machines that, and in some environments it makes sense. We're recycling older PCs and making them into essentially, VDI terminals. Can be good, but there's that potential there of local storage, somebody pulling something off of there and so forth and so on. That kind of worries me a little bit from a compliance standpoint. Now, the less profile or the less hardware you can have at the desktop or at the endpoint, the better. So there's a lot of great virtualization terminals that you can use that are out there that really have a low profile. Transmitting the virtual images, the desktop images back and forth to the client from the servers. You want to make sure that communication is encrypted. You may want to separate that out from some of your other networks too. But just watch the wire, watch what's going on from the top to the bottom, and limit access to ports that are unnecessary and services that are unnecessary.
Chris, another one here about virtualization. It's the underpinning for cloud services, but how do we ensure that a cloud or outsourced provider is going to be compliant based on any regulations or issues that we need to maintain based on our industry or vertical focus?
Yeah, that's a great question. So cloud technologies and virtual technologies kind of go hand in hand, and we have Windows Azure, and we have Amazon EC2, and all this other stuff that's out there, and it's some great stuff that you can use. But does it make sense to use one of the larger providers? Well, it depends. I think really you need to have some level of insight into one, understanding what you're on the hook for in terms of compliance regulations, and communicating that clearly to the cloud provider, saying, hey, look, we're under Sarbanes-Oxley, and here's what we're specifically concerned about based on the applications. And one, when you talk with them, see if they understand what you're talking about. The ones that really get it, or will already have, the cloud providers that really get it, will already have a plan well in place, and they've thought about this. And they'll say, yeah, no problem. This is how we deal with that for our clients. These are the kind of reports we can give to you. This is how we mitigate incidents. This is where your information is going to reside, and so forth and so on. And so you have a clear understanding and an idea of exactly how your information is going to be stored, how your applications are going to be secured, how they run the reports, and how they relate to your needs. So if you hear some hesitation on the line when you're talking to these cloud providers, you might want to tell them that it might be a good idea to rethink that.
Chris, one more. What future virtualization technologies do you see on the horizon? It's interesting. We're talking a lot with a lot of security companies. They're wondering how virtualization technologies will be able to better secure virtual environments going forward, how their anti-malware, what next generation anti-malware solutions will work. There's still a lot up in the air, but some ideas that have been tossed around are like central anti-malware technologies, taking virtual snapshots of your desktop and having a central repository. So if a malware infection hits, the anti-malware solution detects that, automatically rolls back to point of origin within a couple seconds or within a minute or something or two, virtually null and voiding the anti-malware breakout. Other things such as, we've always had things like sandboxing when you're talking about application design, when you're using Java or C++ or some other coding language, we can sandbox applications, so there's limited access between that and the OS. How do we use virtualization technologies to not just deliver application virtualization in the traditional sense, delivering a couple applications to the desktop virtually via an appliance or something like that, but how do we individualize or virtualize server applications so they truly run in their own shell, and we emulate or para-virtualize between the OS, and the hypervisor, or even run the application itself on that hypervisor, and so using those types of technologies. There's a lot of things that are getting thrown around. I think it's going to be a pretty exciting time as over the next couple of years when we see all these new technologies come out. Excellent. Thank you so much, Chris. And I'd like to thank all of you here in the audience for your participation and insightful questions today. I hope this webinar met with your expectations. Terakai Corporation will be hosting these regularly, and we'd love your input on topics. Again, thank you so much for your time today, and good afternoon.